So, welcome back to the second morning plenary. I hope that the coffee break resulted in a number of stimulating conversations. I know that I began about 20 conversations that I hope we can continue over lunch. We have two sessions. We're running 15 minutes late, so I think what we want to try and do is, instead of have two 50-minute sessions, is try and make them 40-minute sessions if possible. I hope that isn't a problem. Otherwise, there'll be no lunch for anybody. And I know that a number of you will want to leave for the march. Of course, it would be great to have you stay for the amazing program we're having. But also, I know some of you are activists, and the march is going to cover HIV criminalisation as one of its main themes. And in fact, Kamaria Laffery is going to be speaking about it at around 4 o'clock. But hopefully many of you will stay. And so, first of all, I want to introduce to you my dear, dear friend, a former colleague at the HIV Justice Network and now at UNAIDS, Laurel Sprague, who will be facilitating the session on the benefits and pitfalls of using science in our advocacy to end HIV criminalisation. Over to you, Laurel.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So it's really a delight to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. What we'll do, I thought I would give a few framing remarks, just to put my own thoughts into the mix, and then we'll have a short kind of moderated discussion with our illustrious panelists, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So we'll try to keep things moving quite quickly. And so let me give a few remarks. No, let me introduce first and then give a few remarks. And really, we don't want lunch, right? We'd really rather be here, I was thinking. So everyone stick with us. On the panel with me, you may know everyone, but we have Richard Elliott from the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. We have Chris Beyrer from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We have Paula Munderi from the International Association of Providers of AIDS Care, IAPAC. We have Justice Edwin Cameron from the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And we have Lynette Mabote from the AIDS Rights Alliance of Southern Africa. I would say it doesn't get better than this, but we've got a whole bunch of panels, and they're all just absolutely amazing that are coming up. But this is about as good as it gets. And so I was thinking about this panel, the benefits and pitfalls of using science for advocacy, and thinking about when some of us were doing some early advocacy to combat criminalization, and how science was a bit of a problem because we were asked continually to give evidence that HIV criminalization harmed testing. And no matter how many times we wanted to frame the conversation around basic justice, and we tried to say that the evidence we had was that there was no evidence that the laws had a positive effect in addressing new infections or addressing the epidemic, we were constantly sort of embattled by this question of, well, can you prove that these laws have a detrimental effect? And so the evidence question was always a tricky one. Where we are now, we have a lot of evidence that is useful, a lot of scientific research that's useful, both social research and also biological research, medical research, that's really useful now in making the case against HIV criminalization. So I'm excited about this panel to talk about that a little bit. What I'm also excited about is the opportunity to think about what some of the pitfalls are. Because I think for those of us who have been working in this field, we know there are different narratives that we use and different ways we think about HIV criminalization and the wrongs of HIV criminalization. And so for me, in particular, it's always been a question of justice and a question of injustice, that when two consenting adults make decisions about their sexual behavior, for us to then turn around and lock one of them up and treat them the way that we as people with HIV are treated in HIV criminalization cases is fundamentally unjust. And so it's always been a little tricky for me to try to think about what the scientific arguments are. It's nice when they're helpful, but at what point do we get so caught into the scientific narrative that we forget that no matter what the science says, we're talking about a situation of fundamental justice and injustice. And then to take it another level, also remembering that the people we talk to don't see it necessarily as an injustice, or they don't care if it's an injustice. And so I think it's really an interesting conversation about how we as advocates who care about justice and care about health and care about the bodies of people living with HIV and our well-being use the science, but don't get co-opted so much into the science that we forget where the fundamental questions of justice lie. And so I want to kind of frame this as I can think of three basic narratives that we use around HIV criminalization to argue against HIV criminalization. And one of them is a justice argument, one of them is a science argument, and one of them is a public health argument, which isn't exactly a science argument. It's more about what's effective and what's ineffective. And so I'd like to invite everyone on the panel and in the room to think about those different frames as we talk about the science and using evidence in our advocacy. So thank you for indulging me in my thoughts. And now I will turn to our panelists who you've really come here to hear. And I'd like to first ask Chris Beyrer if you would talk a bit really about the evidence and some of the new exciting science that we have.
Well, thanks so much, Laurel. How's the sound? Can you hear me? Yeah, great. And also, I just want to say, Edwin and the group, you all have been at this so long and have done it so well and so skillfully, and it really does feel as though we're starting to make headway. And I think it's really a powerful moment for this movement. I want to also just say that there is going to be an important document, I think, that is going to really help, that is going to nail down some of the science. It is embargoed, so I'm just kind of whetting appetites here, but it will come out in the Journal of the International AIDS Society on Wednesday, and that is when the embargo will lift. This is an expert consensus statement on the science. And I think that that's also going to be, we hope, a tool, and we invite everybody to use it in their advocacy around this issue. So let me just say, as Laurel said, I'm at Johns Hopkins. I'm in the Department of Epidemiology. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist by training. I also just am coming off the end of being the past president of the International AIDS Society. Actually, this conference is the end of my term in the leadership of IAS. So it's a bit of a relief, but it's been a wonderful professional experience. And I only raise that, first of all, to welcome you all to AIDS 2018 on behalf of the IAS, but also to say that the science was a part of what we as a professional organization in the HIV world really had to look at before we as an organization could sign on to U equals U to the new science of undetectable means untransmissible. And I think that for many of us, there was a lot of compelling evidence, but there really needed to be large, well-done studies in the real world with actual couples having actual sex and not using condoms. Which, for those of us who come from the earlier era where condoms were the #1 prevention tool that we had, we beat people up about using condoms for 25 years. And we always knew that self-reported condom use was never what we thought it was, and there always was evidence that they're hard to use and maintain consistently and in the proper way for life. But nevertheless, the idea that you're going to actually enroll couples, both heterosexual couples and same-sex male couples who are not going to use condoms, and you're going to follow those folks and look at the outcomes, was challenging scientifically. And there have been 2 really well-done studies, both international. The first that was a mix of heterosexual couples and same-sex couples, the partner study led by Jens Lundgren, fantastic leader in our field from Copenhagen. And then the big study, which actually, in my own view as a scientist, was the one that I was the most concerned about, which was transmission between male same-sex couples having unprotected anal sex. And unprotected in the sense, let me be clear about that, condomless anal sex. Protected, of course, by antivirals. Right? We all have to be very careful about that. What we mean now by protected and unprotected has changed. Sex without condoms where one of the partners is on PrEP and adherent to PrEP is also protected sex, not unprotected sex, right? It's PrEP protected sex. And you know, that is language that we've had to change and adopt and understand, again, with the just compelling evidence of the efficacy and effectiveness of PrEP. But really, that opposites attract study followed hundreds of couples having thousands of unprotected, condomless sex acts, where the infected partner was virally suppressed. And here's your morning quiz. We'll see how the coffee break went. How many transmissions? How many linked infections?
0.
Okay, that's all I want to say about the science. Absolutely compelling. And it was the results of that study that really led myself and the IAS as an organization to say, yes, we are on board with this science. Now, to get to Laurel's question, and this will be the last thing that I'll say as part of the opening of this, the benefits of that, I think, are going to be transformative. It is up to all of us now to get jurists, legislators to understand what that means and to grasp that this really is the case, that if people have achieved viral suppression, they do not transmit, and that, you know, that ought to be the basis for how we think about this. You can see the pitfall right away. And the pitfall, of course, is that if someone is living with HIV and they're not virally suppressed, they can transmit. Right? And that there already has been some legislative tussling about that between, for example, a law in North Carolina versus one in California. In my own view, the critical thing that we have to do is to put that back on governments and policymakers and put that back on the medical profession and say, there has always been a compelling reason why people living with this virus should be treated. And that is because it prolongs life and it returns them to health and work and social function, and it is absolutely fantastic therapy. It also has this enormous prevention benefit. If there are untreated people who have barriers to access to treatment, testing, care that they need, treatment that they need, that is a problem of the governments. That is a problem of ministries of health. That's where, if there is any blame, it ought to lie, right? In not getting our, yeah, indeed. And I think we need to start making that argument too, and I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I wonder, Paula, if I could ask you to speak next on as someone representing AIDS service or AIDS care providers. Your thoughts about the science and the benefits and pitfalls of using that in advocacy.
Well, just thank you. And thank you, Edwin, for having me here. It's a real privilege to be a part of your work as well. I describe myself as a physician advocate. In my past life, though, I have been a clinical investigator, and I have also worked in public health policy on HIV. So the public health argument that you alluded to, Laurel, and also the historical place where we were advocating against criminalization to say if we criminalize people, we cannot test. I actually think that in addition to the key evidence that Chris has mentioned, I think the scientific community today, we have finally come to the point where we admit and we dare to articulate out loud that we have the technology to bring an end to the HIV epidemic. So criminalizing HIV is actually against bringing an end to the HIV epidemic, to the extent that it perpetuates the stigma, it criminalizes patients, sends them underground so they do not seek care. So it's not just, it's going to stop people testing, it's actually going to impede our getting to the end of the epidemic, which we have the technology to end. When I was reflecting about the benefits of using science in the justice arena, I have to go back because I've been, doing this for such a long time, and one of the things that comes to mind is this sense that it's very, very, very late. It's taken such an inordinately long time to get here. So I think about was it 20 years ago, with the Swiss statement, where actually they very boldly showed by looking at information and data that the scientific community did not believe were robust enough, but the evidence was there. You know, we had proof of concept that if we give a pregnant woman antiretrovirus, they do not transmit HIV to their baby. And we kind of knew that, we kind of believed that, and we actually rolled out public health programs using that concept, but we still didn't feel that we had enough evidence that treatment was preventive. They looked at a lot of observational evidence where people had unprotected sex, really unprotected sex, but for the reasons of desired conception, condomless sex, and where there had been no transmission. And the scientific community still did not think this was good enough. You know, we needed to wait for the randomized controlled trial in the heterosexual couples, the HPTN-052. That was a lot of years. So HPTN-052 gave us confidence that undetectable is equal to untransmissible. But even then, how long ago is that study, and how long ago between the results of that study and us actually daring to say it out loud? So it's taken a long time, but never mind, we're there now. And what we need to do is to fight against the disinformation, to fight against the lack of ignorance, and to thank you, IAS, for standing behind this. We now have WHO actually standing behind this statement. So slowly to disseminate the news that this is in fact the case. I'll say just one more thing before I give up. The last a couple of weeks ago, while I was preparing to come to the IAS, I was counseling a young man who's like a son to me. He's a young adult. He's in his early 30s. He was born with HIV, and it was really humbling for me to realize that close as I'd been to him, in a bid to help him, sent him to a support group when he was about 16, 17, and was on antiretrovirus. And he says, in the support group, what they made me feel was that, first of all, you put this label on me. Second of all, at a time when I was beginning to explore my sexuality, you basically told me, I am a walking time bomb. I am going to kill somebody. And this really brought me up short, because I did not realize that he'd been going through this. And yet I thought, I'm a physician, I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher, we have a relationship of trust. I'm doing the right thing for you, please stay on your meds. As it turns out, about 3 years ago, he decided, I've had enough, it's not enough, I'm not going to go on taking my medicines. But then he changed his mind again, because he fell in love. And his fiancée is HIV negative, and now we want to talk about how we can keep them HIV free. So going into the protecting his girlfriend with PrEP, or please go on to your medicines again until you get transmitted. But these two young people had no clue about the fact that having an undetectable viral load protects the partner, or that being HIV negative and having an HIV positive partner, you can be protected with drugs. So what I'm trying to say by all this is that we've done a very, very, very poor job of informing the general public, let alone the legal justice system, about the advances in science and about the knowledge that we have as clinicians and investigators, and that we've had for years, but we've done a very poor job of sharing it and trusting our patients and, you know, giving them the confidence to use what are the advances in science.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't need that. They've got me mic'd up. I wonder if you could hand that mic to Justice Cameron, who is gathering all kinds of comments, I see, to speak. We're so lucky to have you here, Justice. And I wonder if you could speak a bit as both someone who's been on this side of the justice system behind the podium, but also an activist and a person living with HIV.
Thanks so much, Laurel, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I pay honor to my fellow panelists, especially the physicians and scientists and the activists, and I also pay honor to Edwin and to the HIV Justice Network. I was a bit disturbed just before the tea break because someone stood up here, Edwin, I can't remember who the person was, and said people with HIV are living in terror. And it unsettled me. And I want to say something, which is that a few years ago I was being extorted. And it was entirely irrational. And I went and told the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, I told my family and friends, and I faced it down and the person apologized. But for 2 months I experienced that terror of the stigma and of the irrationality. How would I, to my country people in South Africa, to the rest of Africa, and to the international press, have faced down the allegation, irrationally, unscientifically, that I passed HIV on to someone. So I just wanted to say that I have experienced that terror as someone living with HIV. In a sense, my public position and my job position accentuated the risk, accentuated the incentive to the extorter before he backed down and apologized, wrote me texts and wrote me a letter. But the fact is that every single person in the world who's living with HIV lives under the terror of irrationality which derives from stigma. Now, in preparing for the panel, I thought of the debate, the current debate, and it's a very important debate about how marriage equality was achieved in America. We achieved sexual orientation equality in South Africa in 1994 when we were the first country that got it included in our constitution, the Mandela Constitution, through justice arguments. I think the path to equality in the Obergefell decision in 2015 was very different. And part of it was an intuitionist argument, not a science argument, but an intuitionist argument that basically said, we are like you. And the downsides of that are now being explored by various philosophers and commentators and gay activists in America. But the interesting thing is it worked. It worked. But intuitionism hasn't worked with HIV. We've had this evidence. We've had it for 25 years that HIV is extremely difficult to transmit. Even with insertive vaginal ejaculative intercourse, and one must always speak about insertive ejaculative vaginal intercourse, don't you agree, Paula? And insertive ejaculative anal intercourse. Even with that, and Chris has outlined reasons in a panel yesterday, he spoke about the particular cell structure of the colon and the rectum, why it is much more dangerous to be the receptive partner in same-sex marriage. But the irrationality has persisted. And we saw it in the denial of health care, which still persists in many parts of the world. I instanced some cases from South Africa. We saw it in President Thabo Mbeki's AIDS denialism. For those of you who think that this is a developing world or an African or a black phenomenon, Lynette and Paula, think of the Canadian Supreme Court. Richard has heard me say this before. Possibly the worst judicial decision ever given was by 9 white Canadian judges in Mabere. And when I had my picture taken just now with Chad Clark and with Robert Suttle, I was very proud to have them taken, but I met for the first time someone in Canada who actually suffered under the Mabere doctrine, which disregarded the science. You had 9 Canadian Supreme Court justices who, as irrationally as President Thabo Mbeki, refused to accept it. So that's my reflection, Laurel. As a judge, we claim to be rational, and we pride ourselves on the rational processes of the law. And obviously in law, you start with the evidence. How did the deceased die? What is the evidence of injustice arising from a particular constitutional breach. But somehow the persistence of these laws is rooted in stigma, which has been the main defining feature of the public management and the public discourse of the epidemic for the last 37 years. And we have to think of ways of overcoming it. I think that Chris's study and the launch tomorrow, the fact that Paula says that these things are changing, are very hopeful signs. And this conference, there are various strategies we must use. I think we've got to use all three that you mentioned, Laurel, in your very enlightening introduction. We've got to use justice arguments. We can never forget them. We've got to use science. And of course, people have pointed out, and I think it's a very important point, that we cannot base our arguments on the fact that to be undetectable is untransmittable. The last viral load blip I had, I started antiretrovirals nearly 21 years ago in November 1997. The last viral load blip I had, which was at 50, very low, was in October 2000, so 18 years ago. And I don't want to be part of a new elite in the HIV struggle. I don't want to create a further barrier, an us and them. So I want us to be careful. I rejoice. I'm not knocking science. Chris, we're grateful for you and for what the physicians do. But we've got to be careful. And we've got to be careful that we're not going to create new barriers. Our epidemic and our response to it has been a response to stigmatizing exclusion of black people in Africa, of poor people, of marginalized inner city communities and black African Americans. So we must be careful that we don't use science in that way. And of course, as Livio Zilli from the International Commission of Jurists rightly points out, to adopt the onus of saying, well, you can't prosecute us because a great proportion of us are undetectable, is to assume an onus that we should never assume when state power is trying to be used. That's the second danger. So let us bear that in mind, and let us use all three arguments. Let us not forget the public health arguments, which I think are enormously persuasive, but they haven't worked yet. We've got to find ways at our meeting today to find out how they will work. Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you very much. So I would like to actually ask Lynette to speak. So can we pass the mic in her direction? Oh, you have one. Okay, perfect. A matching. Hers actually matches. Okay, you'll be next. So the final two speakers on the panel, Lynette and Richard, both are activists, advocates, and people who have legal training and work in the court system and with parliamentarians to really try to both change the laws and to change to make sure that the laws that we have are applied as justly as possible when people like us are prosecuted. So, Lynette, I'd just love to hear your reflections. I don't have a different question for you, but coming from your experience, your reflections on these questions.
Thank you very much, Laurel. Good afternoon, morning, everyone. I think it's morning still. I think the points that have already been raised have quite eloquently highlighted how, these scientific arguments have not always played in our favor, because science needs to be broken down into language that is palatable for the community members. And at current point, we currently do not have treatment literacy in existence anymore. There are about 5 organizations that I can count on one hand who are currently still providing, treatment literacy. And those organizations are also in danger of losing that part of a programmatic approach. And second thing, treatment literacy has changed from what it was when we did not have treatment access. The treatment that you require, the drugs that we're using, everything has changed and has progressed so much that patients, to be honest today, or people living with HIV today, are no longer the doctors of their own bodies. Unfortunately, that is a false narrative that I think we really need to revisit as people living with HIV and ask ourselves, what is it that we do require today and how do we move that forward? Because we don't have donor funding anymore. We don't have the luxury, but how do we continue to keep ourselves updated on the latest science? Secondly, in a lot of countries in which we work as ARASA, viral load testing is a myth. Yes, it's in the WHO guidelines. Yes, it's good to know that, it does exist somewhere when you've got money. But we do know that a lot of our people are paying for their health out of pocket. That is the reality, even within public health systems. So when you've got a broken public health system, people still have to pay out of pocket for specialized services such as viral load. You only get a viral load test if you're immunocompromised. So if your ARVs aren't working, then only you can get it on the public health system. And you're not even insured that you'll get the test results. If you do get them, you get them in 4 months. Otherwise, oh no, we don't have reagents. Oh no, we have to put the test on the donkey fell off the road. These are the challenges, and these are the realities. So the U equals U, thank you very much, Justice Cameron. The U equal U argument, to be honest, is a very privileged argument that is not even going to get us there. As ARASA, we've been doing a lot of work around demand creation for viral load because we are so desperate for it. We're getting to such a desperate point because a lot of people are saying to us, why is it that you're selling us false hope? You told us to demand to create this demand, but there's no supply from government side. What are we supposed to do now? And that is where we're stuck. We really are stuck. So to be honest, we are actually looking at, is there a way to work with pharmaceutical companies to get point of cares in place? Which is why we back to being access advocates, right? We need access to medicines to get us to the next point. So what we've been doing as ARASA is we've been working on this issue for 15 years. And Michaela, Clayton, my director, as you know, has pioneered this, and she's been training so many people. I don't know how, she's such a resilient woman. So when somebody mentioned resilience this morning, I was like, that is Michaela, because ever since I've known, even before, she's been doing this since 2004, and she's been training lawyers on an annual basis, traveling around, training judges on an annual basis, using scientific arguments, using public health arguments, using human rights arguments. And to be honest, it's taken over 15 years for us to start getting the shifts in perception, the shifts in mindsets. So the examples that Annabelle was giving earlier from Malawi and the change, that took a lot of work with members of parliament. We've been working with these members of parliament, butting heads actually with them since 2013. And they're just like human. They're just like, well, no, but these people with the HIV, they don't want to take their medicine. They hide them under the bed. Hey, I'm just like, honestly. So those are the types of really ludicrous arguments that you are against from a member of parliament. So if somebody is at that mind frame, where do you start with the science? You're going to struggle. So you need something else. So secondly, we're seeing that, unfortunately, what's starting to happen is that we are all working in silos, even within the HIV movement. And silos kill, right? Right now, as we sit, we're not having a conversation with the SRH movement. We're not having conversations with the viral load movement, because there is a viral load movement within the HIV movement. So I don't know, our movement is criminalized. There are many parts, but all the parts are not, the puzzle is not coming together. Secondly, 40% of people living with HIV are dying from TB. Who is talking about the 1 million people who die annually from tuberculosis who are living with HIV? No one. And people living with TB are also criminalized. So it's double criminalization. I don't know what it's called. It's a dual criminal. I don't know what the legal term is for that. So people, we're facing that double stigma, double criminalization, and all because you're hosting a disease or you're hosting a pathogen of sorts. So the mountain to climb is very, to be honest, it's a very long road that we need to walk. But we really need to start closing these gaps that we have, because even with our movement is very small. And it's always takes one person to reach 5 people in 1 year, to convince 5 people in 1 year to join HIV Justice Worldwide. There's no time for that. So we really need a scaled up approach for us to get a mass movement going around this and entrench it in something that actually can be palatable and can work, including working with the U equals U movement and getting some sort of consensus with them. Because all of our statements really need to be aligned. As at current point, I think the reason why policymakers, lawyers, judges are also confused is because we ourselves aren't sure of where we should be going and what message we should be telling.
Okay, so, thank you. So I know Chris has to leave, so I just wanted to say thank you for being on the panel, and we understand, of course, and apologies for running late. Okay. So now we've all been waiting to hear from Richard. Yes, we have. I promise you. And I would like, again, not to ask a new question, but to just ask for your reflections now that we've had so much rich discussion come forward, your reflections on this question of the science, the pitfalls, benefits, and using it in advocacy.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to engage in some perilous conduct and challenging a little bit the justice on the panel to a somewhat more complex and nuanced understanding of the way that science has and has not been dealt with by the court in the case that you mentioned and in a previous case, because I think it actually illustrates an important point about the value of science, but the complicated relationship that the courts have had to science. So the first time that our Supreme Court actually was confronted with the prospect of using sexual assault law to prosecute someone for not disclosing their status, there were two things I would say about the science that was at play, and this was 20 years ago now in 1998. Of course, we didn't have the issue of viral load and the effect of treatment on transmission and so on. That wasn't really the issue because it was just in the early days of protease inhibitors. But the court, interestingly, when we tried to advance the public health argument, amongst others, for why HIV criminalization should be limited, one of the concerns that we raised was the potential for creating an additional disincentive for people to seek testing, and that from a public health perspective, that would be ill-advised. The court dismissed that fairly quickly on the basis of, well, this is really sort of speculative. You can't really show us any evidence that it will have this detrimental impact. And yet at the same time, in the same breath, the court said, but we think there's a role for the criminal law to play in deterring people from having what, of course, was then referred to as unsafe sex, meaning condomless sex, or any sex, without disclosing. But yet there was no evidence in front of the court to support that proposition either. So right there, if you put those two propositions side by side, I think we have evidence of stigma at play in the judicial mindset in that case. Fast forward 14 years to the case that you mentioned in Beyrer, where of course the issue of viral load was indeed front and center at that point, as well as the issue of the protective effect of condoms. And again, the court did engage with the science, including the results of HPTN 052, and the unfortunate Cochrane review from 2002 about the effectiveness of condoms in preventing HIV transmission, but again, engaged with them in a fairly surface sort of way, I would say. So there's a bit of a scientific gloss, perhaps, in the decision. But ultimately, I think if you dig deeper, as you have quite properly, stigma was still operative. So on the one hand, the court is saying, well, we don't want to criminalize people when there's just a speculative possibility of transmission. We don't want to trivialize the use of sexual assault law by overextending it in such a fashion. And yet that's precisely what they went on to do. So we had this sort of double think going on in the court judgment. However, it's not an entirely doom and gloom story, even in that judgment, although it was exceedingly disappointing and it's a terrible decision. It did leave open the door a crack, at least with respect to the viral load question, for subsequent developments in the law to say science may advance, advances in treatment may lead us to reconsider where the line should be drawn. And in fact, we have seen through the deployment of science in subsequent cases that jurists have been willing to actually open that door further when it comes to recognizing that people who have a viral load that is undetectable should not be subject to criminal prosecution. So there is hope, at least in that context, notwithstanding a bad Supreme Court decision. We actually have seen some movement, and we've seen similar sort of movement from prosecutors who have been willing, especially in the last year, to be guided by the science, at least with respect to viral load. And so the movement around U equals U has been highly useful. I mean, we actually started some years ago before U equals U to marshal scientific evidence about what the per act risks of transmission were associated with various acts under various circumstances. And that has started to have an effect, even without the U equals U statement, because there have been instances in which prosecutors have been willing, when confronted with that evidence by defense lawyers who are equipped, usually by civil society advocates, to back down in some cases. So that's super important. But even there, and this is a bit the ironic thing to go back to what was being said near the beginning, while we're now seeing a bit of a shift with respect to drawing limits and not criminalizing people who have an undetectable viral load or a suppressed viral load, as it's being referred to, meaning under 200 copies per milliliter in our context, it's becoming actually tricky to get prosecutors to say, and we won't prosecute people who use condoms. So even though that was, the first intervention, and the intervention that has been hammered into everyone's heads from the beginnings is use condoms, use condoms, use condoms. That's the good public health advice. And yet now the criminal justice system is saying, okay, well, we won't prosecute people if they have a suppressed viral load, but we're still maybe going to prosecute people if they use condoms, even though that has been the message from the beginning. And I would argue that the use of the condom with your partner, in fact, is clear evidence of an intent to avoid transmission. And yet those are people now who risk continuing to be prosecuted. So this is a potential pitfall of all of the wonderful excitement around U equals U, which absolutely we must maintain and we must use. But we're running into a problem now with actually getting more restraint when it comes to using condoms, or refusing to prosecute people who engage in oral sex, for example, even though we've had the science for years to show that the risk of transmission per act is exceedingly small, not even worth registering. So it's sort of an odd paradoxical position to be in now, the way that science has actually played out in the courtroom. And just one last point about this. I mentioned that there was a review, a Cochrane review in 2002 about the effectiveness of condoms in preventing transmission. And this is a potential pitfall of using the science. When the courts don't engage with it in a sophisticated way, it provides a scientific gloss to justifying continued overcriminalization that is rooted in stigma. So that Cochrane review said condoms are 80% effective in preventing transmission of HIV. That's the headline message that comes out of that Cochrane review from 2002. That has been misinterpreted and misimplied in a number of court cases that we're aware of in our context to say, oh, well, condoms aren't good enough then because there is this residual risk. What they have failed to appreciate, and what we have tried to get scientists to weigh in on, and they are doing, is that in fact, that 80% figure needs to be a little more unpacked and understood in a more sophisticated sort of way. And one of those is that 80% figure is actually a population level figure that builds into that figure that there will be instances in which condoms break occasionally or condoms aren't used properly. When we do have a condom used properly and it is intact, HIV will not pass through the condom, as we've known from the beginning. The risk of transmission in such a circumstance is 0. And yet that point has not often registered the way it ought to with courts. And so this is where we get the highest court in our country sort of simplistically repeating this 80% figure and saying, well, that's not good enough for us to withhold the harsh application of the criminal law. And so that's where we need the scientists to come in, including in the statement that's being released on Wednesday, to speak specifically not just to the U equals U question, but to other circumstances in which there are other factors reducing the risk of transmission from what is already per act exceedingly small. We really need to not lose that in all the really important messaging around U equals U, or else we risk creating this additional underclass of people who, for a variety of social justice reasons usually, don't connect to care, don't get tested, don't achieve viral suppression, and remain therefore at greater risk of continuing to be prosecuted. We can't lose that part of our advocacy, I think. And I'll stop there and give it back to our moderator because I know we're out of time.
We've got a red light. Well, thank you. So let me just apologize because we don't actually have time for Q&A, and I wasn't about to stop any of the thoughtfulness that was happening.
Moderator, can I ask you a question?
Certainly. Well, let's ask if we have the indulgence of the audience.
There's a specific question. In the booklet that we got with our meeting pack for the AIDS conference, there's an interview with one Ms. Laurel Sprague. And she said something that I endorsed at a meeting yesterday, which is that no one who has had consensual sex with another human being should be prosecuted. Now, how do we square that? I endorsed it, so I'm going to share the applause, but Laurel said it. Now, how do we square that with the difficult instances that Edwin and Kat mentioned before tea time? That's a question for you, Laurel. Before I endorse you again, I want to hear what you say to it.
Okay, I apologize. I couldn't be here before tea time because I had to chair a meeting. So what were the difficult circumstances?
Well, there was a famous prosecution in England where it appeared that there was, in fact, malevolent intent deliberately to infect the sexual partner.
Okay, I know that case. Okay, yeah, no, that's a really hard case, and I'll try to be really brief. But as a woman and as a positive woman, there are issues around HIV criminalization that I've really had to struggle with, because we know we live in an oppressive, patriarchal society in which women are not valued equally to male partners, and that we know that there are men, whether they have HIV or not, who use women for their own purposes, for whatever, and with no care or concern for our health and our well-being. We know this happens time and time again, and we also know that there are lots of other circumstances where transmission happens in heterosexual relationships that aren't about a lack of care and concern, but are about social justice issues and stigma. So I'm not saying that every time a woman acquires HIV from a man that it's because of neglect or ill will. But we do know that, women have to face ill will from men. It's just ubiquitous. So some of the issues around HIV criminalization have been really challenging to me. But I think at the end of the day, what I have said to probably many times, I don't know, at least to myself, is that we've created social systems in which women do not have the power that men have. And then women acquire HIV from male partners often. And then we pick one or two of those men and decide they're the monster. And despite the fact that we've got an entire social system set up that values men much more than it values women and puts women at risk, instead of addressing that social system, we pick out a scapegoat. And it's usually the most vulnerable scapegoats, right? Because they can't get the kind of justice that they need. And we lock them up instead of actually putting our energy to changing the systems that would make women empowered enough to own our own bodies and our own sexuality, and men empowered enough to respect that and to own their own bodies and their sexuality and their responsibility. So I don't know if that perfectly answers the question, but it's the way I've worked in my mind with those challenges. Thank you. So apologies that we don't have time for Q&A, but we will have some time for lunch after the next wonderful panel. I don't want to take any more of the panel's time. Are you introducing the next panel? Would you like the card? Okay. Thank you all, and thank you to the wonderful panelists.
Thank you so much to Laurel and this incredible, thoughtful, nuanced conversation about how we use science and advocacy. So I'd now like to introduce Naina Khanna from Positive Women's Network USA, who's going to be facilitating the next panel on women and HIV criminalization, feminist perspectives. Naina, would you want to come and then welcome your panelists to the floor?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing? What a morning it's been. So powerful, right? Thank you so much. All the folks who have been here presenting, all the survivors for sharing your stories, incredibly powerful. I want to go ahead and invite my panelists to come up here. I know we're trying to move quickly, so we're going to have an incredible panel on feminist perspectives on HIV criminalization, featuring Sarai Chisala-Tempelhoff from the Women Lawyers Association of Malawi, Michaela Clayton from ARASA, AIDS and Rights Alliance of South Africa, Kristin Dunn from the Watch Project, and Dion Haywood from Women with a Vision. Welcome, and come on up here. And please sit wherever you're comfortable. I am really excited about this particular session. I think it follows really well off the conversations we've just been having. In particular, kind of thinking about U equals U, how science gets sort of differently applied, how the law gets differently applied for folks, right, depending on who folks are. And so part of what we know is that HIV criminalization does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context of lots of other forms of social inequality and the way that bodies are policed and surveilled very differently, right? So in the U.S. context, which is where I work, primarily, we have a long history of surveilling and policing bodies, particularly of Black people, and certainly of immigrants and indigenous people. And that was used for very specific reasons, right? These forms of surveillance, policing, and control, particularly around sexuality and reproduction, have been used specifically in the service of capitalism and racialized capitalism as it relates to the legacy of slavery in the U.S. and genocide and how the country was actually built. And so in many ways, HIV criminalization laws, which started in the U.S. and were kind of exported throughout the world, one of the great things we export all over the globe is a continuation of that legacy of racialized social control and also social control of queer bodies, right? So this is, I think, very clearly fits into the conversation we've already been having, and that's what our panelists are going to talk about today. And so we are going to we're going to hear from folks who are working in really different contexts around the world and doing very different types of work that I think are really exciting. And so one of the things I just wanted to throw in is that, you know, in the U.S., somebody asked a question about data earlier and sort of like, what do we know about the ways that, about the intersections between race and HIV criminalization? And I think we know a lot. You know, folks will try to tell you that, like, maybe there's not enough articles out there, but we know a lot, actually. It's very clear that in a U.S. context, for sure, and I think throughout the world, people of color have really different levels of access to various types of resources. Bodies are surveilled and policed even before an HIV diagnosis, right? Some people are more likely to interact with the criminal justice system and more likely to be more likely to have negative consequences from a criminal justice system independently of HIV status because of who they are, because they are people of color, because they are trans, because they are queer. And so this is no different. In California, Sean talked earlier about the law we were able to pass modernizing several criminalization statutes in California last year. That was a big deal in part because 95% of the prosecutions and convictions happening under that law were actually happening under one felony solicitation statute. So 95% of them were targeting people engaged in or perceived to be engaged in sex work, right? And even though we had lots of other HIV-specific criminal laws on the books, it was that one that was actually being used the most. Also, the data from California showed that 43% of our convictions related to HIV status were women, even though 13% of our epidemic in California is women. And Black and Latinx folks were 2/3 of the cases in California, even though they comprise about half the population of people living with HIV in California, right? So that's just one state in the whole globe, but people think of California as a relatively progressive state, and that's why I think it's important to sort of share that data, because that's the context that all of us are working in, right? So without further ado, let's hear from our amazing panelists, and I wanted to invite Michaela to start us off. Why is it important to take a feminist perspective on HIV criminalization?
Thanks. I don't know if many of you, well, I'm not sure if it's the same in different regions, but certainly in Southern Africa, the beginning of the epidemic or early on in the epidemic, the public health messaging was, it's not who you are, it's what you do. Does anyone remember that messaging? Yeah. It's not who you are, it's what you do. And I think the message they were trying to get across was that HIV affects everybody. But in the context of HIV criminalization, who you are is really critical. If you're a woman and if you're Black, it's very different than if you're a white heterosexual male. And I've been working on HIV criminalization for a long time, and I'll never forget the first time we had a meeting in Southern Africa on criminalization. It was just early 2000s. And what was really striking, and for me, which is something that's quite ironical, is that the people pushing for this legislation to criminalize HIV transmission were women's groups. Women's groups were very strong on pushing for criminalization of HIV with a view to protecting women who were being infected by partners in situations where they had no control over their own bodies. So you could understand where that argument was coming from, that this push was there. But it was the most incredible meeting because as we started unpacking, and it was a topic that none of us were really familiar with, as we sat around unpacking what does criminalization of HIV mean for women, it was like these light bulbs started going on around the room because it was like, actually, women are normally the first to know their status, certainly where I come from, through going to antenatal clinics or whatever. We know that we do, unfortunately, live in a very patriarchal society where women don't have the control over their bodies that men do. Women are not valued as men are. So it's incredibly difficult for women to enforce safer sex decisions. So you go to the antenatal clinic, you find out you're HIV positive, you come back, you can't disclose that you're HIV positive to your husband or partner because if you do, you're very likely to get kicked out of the house. You're often economically dependent on your male partner, and so your options are very limited. You also can't enforce safer sex decisions because your male partner is going to go, where does this come from? You know? And then at the end of the day, the people who get prosecuted are women. They're blamed for bringing HIV into the home. And it's women who are in situations where they can't control often, decisions about their own sexual health and sexuality. But it's women who get prosecuted. And when we unpacked that, it was like, ooh, okay, maybe this isn't such a great idea. So, just to set the scene, I think, I think it is incredibly important to take a feminist perspective in the context of criminalization because it really does depend on who you are as to who is most impacted by HIV criminalization. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michaela. And I think you really lifted up a lot of important points. And I think one of the things, we don't talk about enough, perhaps, is how people of all genders are impacted by patriarchy, right? And so maybe the next time we have a Beyond Blame on this panel, maybe we'll have some men up here and people of all genders to really talk about this issue, which impacts all of us. So thanks for lifting that up. So patriarchy also structures responses, how advocacy gets done. Sarai, talk to us a little bit about the push to criminalize HIV in Malawi and how a feminist perspective informed your response.
Thank you for the question, and thank you to HIV Justice Network for bringing me here and the opportunity to sit on such an amazing panel with some people that I really admire. I thought a lot about the question when I was asked to be a part of this panel. Because much like Michaela pointed out, the feminist push was actually behind a lot of these laws that we are now having to walk back. As you were talking about the divisions in America being largely on race lines, criminalization or these arguments in Malawi are taking place along a class. The division is on across classes. I think much like Lynette pointed out in the earlier panel, the privilege issue was one that was very clear. So the feminist response to this push to criminalize was a mixed one because a lot of women supported what they thought to be war protections. And in fact, women living with HIV, when we met with them to discuss the content and the implications of the bill, were saying, what's going on with the bill? We've been waiting for this bill for so many years. We need this law. We need the protection of this law. And the idea that law is so powerful or a powerful tool for changing social realities is one that struck me about Malawi just across the board. So we have a great body of gender-related laws that were the result of the push of that early feminism. And I'd like to think of them as the Beijing platform women. They are the ones who brought about what are actually in some ways quite radical changes, but they aren't, as we unpack the law, as we look into what does it mean, how would this play out? Who is actually going to be targeted by this? We realize that a lot of what they fought for and thought of as being protective were actually the very provisions that were then going to be used to incarcerate women, to prosecute women. So there was a little bit of silence, actually, from the feminist or the women's movement when it came to conversations around the bill. And I think it was because of this confusion about why should we be fighting against something that we have fought for to protect us? And it came down to what Michaela pointed out, explaining, in fact, what we did was we sat, myself and so many other incredible activists who were involved in this. We sat with grassroots networks of women living with HIV and took them through the proposed law, literally provision by provision. And at the end of that, they then took it up because it was clear to them how this would play out in the reality of their lives, because they are the ones who are who fall pregnant, who are tested, whether they like it or not, when they show up at the antenatal clinic, and therefore would be the first ones to know about their status and would have that knowledge of their status used in a legal sense as a sign of their liability under those the very transmission provisions that they thought of as being protections that they were fighting for. So I don't know, I kind of have lost my train of thought, but what it was really was that it took that legal empowerment aspect. It took giving people the knowledge, the understanding of the law in ways that they could then use it. And then we took a back seat. And the rest of the whole conversation was driven by the women who said to these parliamentarians, there was people there saying to them that, look, this is very important because we need to protect the unborn. We must protect the unborn from HIV. And this one woman, I'll never forget, she stood up and said, before you care about the baby in my womb, I care about the baby in my womb. I care. And that was it. They spoke such truth to power in ways that can only be done, I think, by the collaboration across sectors, across classes, across races, the actual reaching out in meaningful ways, not just bringing documents, but explaining what a document will play out, how it will play out in people's lives, and then allowing them to take that up and fight that fight.
And what ended up happening? What were the results?
Almost overnight. I see that picture there. That was a group of women living with HIV. They put together those posters by themselves. A lot of those posters are talking about my body, my right. And they spontaneously put together a song that was against this one tricky provision that remained in the bill, Section 43. And any time that it was in a meeting with parliamentarians, and any time that the parliamentarians would talk about how this is so important and this is so necessary, they would just stand up and start singing and say no to Section 43. And that was it. Section 43 was deleted.
Wow.
So it was them. It was them.
It's so powerful, and I love that story so much because I feel like it also embodies a different kind of approach to advocacy, that's also very feminist and creative. So thank you for sharing that. Dion, you have been working for a long time at the intersection of different forms of criminalization and ran a pretty badass, amazing campaign in the state of Louisiana, which for folks who don't know is actually, I think, the state in the U.S. with the highest number of people who are incarcerated. And you did a pretty amazing campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about the campaign you ran, what was going on, kind of behind it, and how it intersected with HIV criminalization?
Hello, everyone. As I start the story of how we got started, I have to say, as a Black woman living in the U.S. in what is considered, what was just ranked as the most racist state in the U.S., the state of Louisiana, I have to start out by saying that there is no way that I can start the story without talking about carceral feminism. I wanted to put that word in the room.
Explain what you mean.
So to make it mean and quick in my way, I see it as a practice of white feminists, because that's who I've experienced it from, white feminists who want to save people, who want to save. They don't want to figure out how to help shut down shit. Oh. Shut down some things and systems. They would prefer to, everything they do is punitive. And so as I tell you the story of our campaign and our win, I have to talk about it, how we create these laws and how they are punitive and they're all about punishment and how that is steeped in white supremacy. So I wanted to say that. So, many of you have heard of Hurricane Katrina and what happened in the Gulf states, what happened in New Orleans, where we are located. To make it real short, the federal government, people still haven't returned home, but they found a way after Hurricane Katrina in 2006 or 7, I want to say it was 6, to give the state of Louisiana millions of dollars to combat violent criminals. And we were back in New Orleans pretty early, and a large part of the people we work with are sex workers and Black trans women. Majority of the people we work with are Black people. And we started, one day nobody came into office, next day no one came into office, and they didn't come in because they had all been charged with a crime against nature. And in the state of Louisiana, crime against nature is solicitation of anal or oral sex. And with that charge comes an automatic felony conviction where you have to, there is a picture of that too. You have to register, follow all federal guidelines as a sex offender in the US. And so everyone told us there was no way that you can fight this. There's no way you can do anything about this. Because we've all tried before. Your organization is full of Black women. Y'all don't have a lot of money. Y'all are poor. You're Black and you're a lesbian. And I was like, thank you, but I know. Thank you for sharing. I've known for many years. But we decided that because we are Black women and because we say we stand with people and because we consider our work to be steeped in Black feminist theory, that we were going to fight. And so we met some amazing lawyers and we tried a different strategy. It had been tried before, but always by white gay men who lost because they weren't thinking intersectionally. How is this affecting everyone? Because the law itself actually was started, it's a at the time, 203-year-old law that was started to fight gay men, to stop gay men in the French Quarter. That then in the 1980s became a way to use against Black, cis, and trans sex workers. So we have to think intersectionally, but we decided we were going to fight. We didn't think we were going to win, but we did, and ended up removing over 800 people from the sex offender registry. But the strategy was much like what you said, which feels really good, is that we just started putting people in a van and taking them to the Capitol. We would literally go to the Capitol, and a lot of people don't know that it's their right to talk to the lawmaker. If we're going to change anything, we are going to have to change how people see who runs what. And that's something we haven't done a good job at. And so at Women with a Vision, so this picture is actually, we bought like about 100 women to the state capitol. And so we started a Black Women's Advocacy Day because it's important for Black women to be seen, especially all over the US, but particularly in the US South, because even today, if I went to testify, they would say, well, we're gonna let a white woman, we got a white woman, we're gonna talk first, as if her life matters more than mine. And when we do that, we perpetuate the idea that Black lives don't matter. I have time? Oh, I have time. So what was important about this case is people really question and challenge, you're not talking about what's happening to gay men. Yes, we are. You're not talking about what's happening to everybody else. You're making this about women. And I was like, no, we're strategically placing the people most affected at the forefront.
Come on.
And by doing so, especially with 97, if you looked at the sex offender registry at the time, 97% of the people on the sex offender registry just in Orleans Parish were Black women. 97%. So when you have sex offender on your ID, think about how we move around the world. And so the campaign was really about, you're stopping me from parenting. You're stopping me from being a mother. You're stopping me from getting a job. For the very people in the US you say are lazy and don't want anything, you're keeping me from being what I want to be. Secondly, the second part of the strategy was really just talking about how you're putting individuals at risk for HIV. You're putting sex workers, you're putting everyday people in the picture that was up was actually a grandmother who was struggling with addiction in the 1970s, who had been charged, but many people who had been charged before Hurricane Katrina, judges didn't enforce it. Many of them didn't believe in it. They didn't feel like it was just or that it would work. So they didn't enforce it. It was only after Governor Jindal decided to enhance the law and make it harsher than it was by raising the bar by 20 years, hard labor, as a part of the conviction. And if you came out, you had to pay $500 to register as a sex offender. You had to pay, you had to register yourself, and you had, I think, 5 days to do this. So think about what it means for people who are incarcerated when they come out of jail. How many people have $500? And for people involved in sex work, how do you think they got that $500? Right? And so it was all about helping communities see that this did not benefit our community. So our strategy was, I really didn't want to talk to lawmakers. I wanted to talk to them as little as possible. I didn't want to talk to, we wanted to put our energy in what it would mean to get our community involved in this case, what it would mean to have communities stand up and say, this is not right. And that was, I think that was the win. That was mobilization, that was engaging community, and it was actually using a feminist lens by being intersectional that won. And I'm just so grateful for the women who were a part of that campaign because they led that campaign. For some of you can think about, if any of you have ever encountered people who don't feel powerful, who don't have a voice, we had women, they was like, Miss Dion, I combed my hair today. And I would be like, absolutely beautiful, because they didn't want to, and I'm ready to go to Baton Rouge, which is the state capital. And it was for the first time, like, I get to fight for me. Sometimes as activists, we think it is our job to fight for people, but we're supposed to give them the tools to fight for themselves. And I'll end by saying that I think the large amount of policy work that we're doing at Women with a Vision about 7 years later is because after that, the women were like, so Ms. Dion, what we doing now? What's next? And so this is why intersectionality has to be a part of the HIV movement. I cannot think about HIV criminalization without thinking about, at this moment, with a new possible Supreme Court pick in our country, that is gonna probably end Roe versus Wade, access to safe abortions in our country. I have to think about HIV criminalization and abortion.
That's right.
Because I know who's gonna be targeted.
Thank you. We'll follow up. We'll have some questions to follow up. But I do want to make sure we have some time to hear from Kristin as well. So Kristin, you've been using some really interesting, like body-centered feminist approaches to addressing HIV criminalization. Tell us a little bit about the Watch Project and the work you've been doing.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about on top of what I'm here for. Watch is Women, Art, and the Criminalization of HIV, using a methodology called body mapping. So it's like an art therapy approach. It takes place in a retreat setting. So women are there together for 5 days, able to speak uncensored and without all of their commitments of life and family tugging at them constantly. And I'm from Saskatchewan. It's a province in Canada that has the highest rates of HIV in the country, the highest rates of new diagnoses. Most of those are in the Indigenous community. Most of those are people who inject drugs. Not all, of course, but many, and therefore it's highly stigmatized and highly ghettoized. And we are looking at the impact of colonization. The Watch study is national. We had workshops in Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, so across the country. And I'm going to try and regroup a little bit because as we're having echoed here, when we're talking about criminalization, we're talking about issues surrounding disclosure. And when we talk about disclosure, when it comes to women, we have to talk about violence against women. Disclosure is not always an option. Condoms are not always an option. If you're engaged in sex work, and especially if it's survival sex work, he's going to just pay you more not to use a condom. If you're at home with a husband or your romantic partner, he may coerce you. You may not be at liberty to disclose because of fear of violence, because of financial reasons or whatever. It's not always an option. There's often not room to negotiate. So we're taking an already existing power imbalance. We're taking the results of colonization and marginalization. We're taking the most vulnerable people in society, and we're adding another level of leverage and weaponization to be used against women. That's what these laws are achieving. I want to go back to something that Naomi said at the beginning, that these laws are an opportunity to express discrimination. These laws are an opportunity to exact colonial control. These laws are an opportunity to leverage increased violence against women and increased control over women's bodies. And the laws fail to recognize the ways in which it is unsafe for women to even have discussions surrounding disclosure in the first place.
Tell us a little bit about the body mapping work.
The body mapping itself?
Yeah.
How the process works, do you mean?
What is the work?
What the heck is it? I think we've got... What is this? Okay, how to make this real quick and Cole's notesy. Essentially, you've got a giant piece of paper. It's people-sized. This originated in South Africa, a collaboration between a psychologist and an artist. And the idea was, I think at the time, please correct me if I'm wrong, because women were facing imminent death and orphaning their children. It was a way to cope with that reality and leave behind some kind of legacy. And then treatments became available. Okay, so now you get to live with stigma and ostracization from your communities. And where I come from, Saskatchewan, that's still a major problem. We have northern communities where people are forced to leave, or they choose to leave because the community will ostracize them. They may face violence. Their family members may face violence. So you lay out your body, you outline your body, you outline another person's body, which later becomes the representation of your support. The shadow that's always with you, not in a dark sense or an ominous sense, but in a sense of whether we stop to think about it or not, we always have supports in our lives. So as we're working with women, we start off with very innocuous questions like, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of any body map, where did you come from? And in the upper corner, you'll see where are your goals, where are you going to? And by the way, before I forget to plug, we have a gallery in the Global Village. We're on the ground level. We were given 802, was it? It's a corridor. Don't find us there. Look on your map for the dining symbol, because we take up more space than a little tiny corridor, as we should. Mm-hmm. And you'll find us there, and you'll find also, you'll see the body maps, and you'll read the women's own words. So I don't want to spend too much more time on the process of body mapping. You'll find out what was revealed. But what I can tell you is one of the most compelling things ahead of the findings was that women whose voices are never heard because nobody ever asks got to be heard. First, during the process, at the end of every day, as the questions go deeper and deeper and deeper into the most painful experiences of life with HIV and life as marginalized women, then we would share together with an elder present. Most of our body mappings took place with an Indigenous elder present, to guide and protect women through the process, right? So that women could feel protected and sheltered. So first, women were heard amongst ourselves, and now women are being heard in a wider context. And for most of the women who participated, that was a first. And it was extraordinarily empowering and revelatory that anybody even wants to listen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to make sure we have time for some questions from the audience. That's incredibly powerful. And I think part of what I'm struck by is some of the themes that are coming up here, right? So storytelling, political education as a tool and resource for our communities, breaking down these barriers to access and power. And so as folks are kind of collecting their thoughts if they have questions. We also have social media questions that might be coming in. If folks on social media have questions, they should be using the hashtag BeyondBlame2018, just as a reminder. Are there any questions from the audience at this time? Sure.
Because there are no questions yet, I want to add one thing.
I do have a question for the panel too. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add it quickly. I want to go back to the idea that whether women sought it out ourselves or whether it was imposed, the paternalistic nature that we're going to protect you, these laws, the way it started out, I just want to note that characteristic of all things paternal, it achieves the opposite ends and creates more damaging and regressive outcomes. And then I want to pass it down.
Thank you. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, from your perspectives in the work that you've been doing, how do you think about building power longer term, through some of the strategies you've been using? Like, how have these strategies been tools for building longer term power for communities that are historically disenfranchised and shut out of systems?
So one of the things we do at One With a Vision is create space. I don't think we think enough about what it means to have safe space, healing space, spaces that just allow you to be yourself, that when you come in the door, there's no expectations of you. And we don't, how could I say it? We don't give people a bunch of crap that they don't need. And in saying that, I'm saying that a lot of times when people, we all own a power, our own energy, our own process and way of thinking. And it's just about giving people the space to come into that. And I think that's what's, as simple as it sounds, that's what we've used at Women with a Vision. It's meeting people where they are. We have I would love not to have a diversion program, but it is the U.S. and I still have to deal with the criminal justice system. But it is the only diversion program that is operated at our agency.
Can you explain what a diversion program is?
So a diversion program is actually going through some social or nonprofit process, a lot of times by the courts, that you follow these rules we have set aside for you and we won't put you in jail. Yeah.
It's like an alternative.
It's an alternative to incarceration. This one is a little different. It took us 5 years to get them to do it, but we did it. And in the program, we don't tell any sex worker that comes through our door, now this is what you're gonna do first, and you're gonna attend this session. It's kind of like, hey, how are you? Why don't you tell us what's going on with you? What do you need from us? How can we help you move forward? How can we help you not get arrested again? How can we, everything is about what they need. And it is amazing to watch people make decisions for themselves in ways that they never thought they could. And that's how you build power, because it's internal.
So for the Women Lawyers Association, what we've been trying to do is to create spaces where women and children, that's the communities that we serve largely, can come forward for legal assistance, or legal advice, free legal assistance, free legal advice. And what we've tried to make it also is not just this is what you must do, but here are the options that are available to you. What would you want to do? And this is how you would go about it. And showing people the kinds of access that they actually have to these justice systems that they aren't necessarily always aware of. Dion mentioned that people are not really aware that they can go up and speak to lawmakers, for example. A lot of women are not aware that they can go to the courts unaccompanied, that they can demand certain things of the justice system. And so that's been a big part of the work that we're doing.
Educating people about their rights.
Educating people about their rights, but not just about their rights, but actually this is how you get child support. Because, or this is how you can get a protection order. This is how you go about meeting with the police or the magistrates, or we have a decentralized system. And so there are other government offices that are relevant to the same woman who is dealing with HIV is the same one who needs access to sexual and reproductive health services. It's the same person who needs access to whether it's a maintenance order or a protection order because of violence in their lives or violence around their children's lives. It's the same person. And so too often we only deal with the one issue, but what we've been trying to do is to deal with as much of it as we can at the same time. Do you need information about how to register your land ownership? Is that something that you need to know about? Do you need to know about systems that are available to you beyond the traditional leadership? So for a lot of women in Malawi, the closest justice system that they have is not actually the courts. It's a traditional justice system. And even though we like to think that we've advanced so much because we now have these laws that say you can go straight to court, those courts are not actually within even the imaginings of the women that we largely work with. That's not even what they're thinking about. They're thinking about their families, the marriage counselors, and the traditional leadership in the community where they live. And so helping people navigate those systems is a big part of what we're trying to do. And at the same time, working with those systems to make them more friendly and more aligned with the laws of the country. Because we are living in a very dual system. It's actually a dual system. And bridging that is a big part of it. And I think as feminist Malawians, though, what we are still struggling with is, so you said that in America, you're dealing with white women's feminism, right? I think in Malawi, what we're doing is too much of elite black women's feminism. And that feminism doesn't really leave space at the table for grassroots activists whose feminism is based on what is current, what is urgent, and what is very, very real in their lives. Sometimes it ends up being very high level and very academic. And so the challenge that we had, for example, in fighting the criminalization of HIV in the bill, was that we were having the same conversation around the table with the exact same people over and over again. And it wasn't actually moving anywhere because it was all being approached. I mean, it could very easily have been one of those of us who are advocating against HIV criminalization who were sitting on the other side of the table talking about how important it is for us to have these laws that protect women and so on and so forth, because we're basically the same people. And breaking that cycle, which was so powerful in that process, I think is something that needs to happen across the board for other areas where there is limited access and the advocacy is stuck because the two worlds are just not meeting. The people whose lives are actually affected by these issues are not being brought to the table. Their voices are not being amplified. They're not being given the power to take on the conversation in their own terms, talking about what is actually the situations or the challenges that they face. And I think that's just something that I wanted to add to it.
Thank you so much. And I think part of what you're lifting up, what a couple of you lifted up, is really sort of like the limits of our imagination sometimes about alternatives. So most of us are socialized into a system where the criminal justice system is a place to go for like safety, or there's some sort of solution through laws and punishment and the carceral state. And so a lot of that has to actually be undone with the realization that the laws were never really designed for most of the communities that we care about, right? They were actually designed to control and punish the communities we care about, and the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? So yes, we have a question in the audience. Great, we're going to take this one question.
I feel privileged, thank you. So my name is Agata, I come from Europe, and I just wanted to add up something from the European context, coming from the European context and coming from the sex workers' rights movement as well. So I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's very empowering. It's amazing. And I think what was said here and what's really important from my perspective is the need to think about criminalization of HIV in the context of other forms of criminalization.
Yes.
Because we very frequently tend to, this is at least my impression, think HIV criminalization in terms of transmission, exposure, non-disclosure, and somehow the issue of sex work criminalization, which is a huge problem in the European context as well as in the US and many other places. Criminalization of drug use, for example. So this, or abortion, which I come from Poland, we will be facing 100% criminalization of abortion in several months, I guess. So I think it's very important to think about it, think intersectionally. So for example, we have, and I think this is one of the most important points to be taken out from here that was made here. So for example, we have criminalization of migration that's also not that frequently being discussed in the context of HIV criminalization. And actually it was said here already that most of the cases coming from Western European countries, criminalization of HIV transmissions, are cases brought against migrants, mostly men coming from Africa. And this is actually not ending, because only in 2012 we had a situation when there was a crackdown on sex workers or women assumed to be sex workers and using drugs in Greece, who were migrants coming from Eastern Europe, which is seen, of course, as a center of pandemic in the European context right now. And in Greece, they were tested forcibly, what happens quite a lot to sex workers, especially in Eastern Europe, and then charged for HIV exposure without anyone even bringing up the cases against them. So I think it's very essential to try to link those issues as much as possible.
Thank you so much for raising that. And we don't have time, I'm sorry, for more questions, but I want to encourage you to continue the conversation over lunch. This is very rich. Thank you for surfacing that. That's exactly what we are dealing with in the U.S. also, where there's mandatory testing of people who are picked up for soliciting, right? So, and that discriminatorily targets, it targets folks who are picked up for just walking while trans down the street, as well as people who are actually engaged in sex work. And so, so that's mandatory testing, and then you can have an increased sentence enhancement if you are, if you're living with HIV. So the problems are very similar. And I think, you know, one of the things this really points to is, if we're serious about challenging criminalization, the importance of really talking to the International AIDS Society about moving the International AIDS Conference, which is proposed to be in the United States in 2020. Right now, we know that the U.S. is a very unsafe place for all the communities we're talking about. Our Congress recently passed FOSTA SESTA, which is legislation targeting sex workers, driving them further underground, to the point where our national sex worker organization, the Desiree Alliance, one of our sex worker organizations, has had to cancel their annual convening because it's actually not safe for them to convene publicly. But the U.S. has a current ban on sex workers, a current ban on people who use drugs entering and applying for visas. We have a current Muslim ban that applies to 5 countries. We have current entry bans on North Korea and Venezuela. We don't know what's going to be in place by 2020. Things are likely to get worse. The U.S. is also currently demanding social media handles for the past 5 years of anybody who is applying for a visa to come into the country. And so we are really clear that this conference cannot be in the United States in 2020. I can promise you from on the ground, and I think a lot of U.S. folks can as well, it is a very hostile and dangerous place, even for folks who are already there. And we would not want any of our comrades to be put in harm's way. So please, if you can go to the next slide, we are asking folks to sign on, ask IAS to demand that IAS announce their decision to move the conference. There is a website, www.aids2020forall.org. We also have a sign-on form that you can fill out and show your support for moving the conference. We'll have lots of activities while we're here. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists for raising all these important intersectional issues. Really appreciate you all framing this issue so broadly and bringing up these many intersections of forms of structural and interpersonal violence as they connect to the criminalization of people living with HIV. Thank you.
And thank you, Naina, for facilitating so powerfully as well, and for everyone staying in the room and listening. I just wanted to highlight, we are running a little bit late, but we really do need to come back at 2 o'clock for the lunch break. Now, following on from the very rich conversations, there are going to be 3 breakout sessions, and the first one really follows on from this conversation about building bridges across movements, linking HIV criminalization with the criminalization of abortion and drug use and gender expression and sexuality and sex work. And that's a panel that will be in here, starting at 2 o'clock until 3:30. If you want to learn about how to work with the media, there's some incredible expertise based on this incredible toolkit that PWN did, that Janet Butler-McPhee from the Legal Network and Nicola from the Institute of Many will be co-facilitating in Breakout 2, which is over there in a cinema. And for the lawyers who are interested in really getting down the nuances of legal strategies, there's going to be an incredible workshop over there, co-facilitated by Seth Earn of AIDS Free World and Cecile Kazakhstan of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. So with that, I just want to remind you, you should go to your breakout room at 2 o'clock after lunch. There'll be a coffee break at 3:30 for 50 minutes. Then we'll come back here at 3:45 for our final plenary that Lynette and Naina will co-facilitate. So thank you all very much. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock in your various breakout rooms.
Can I just say one thing? Sorry, it would be remiss of me on a feminist panel. I want to pay tribute to a very old friend and comrade, Prue Mabote, who died last year. It was her birthday on the 21st, and I just want to pay tribute to a great feminist comrade and activist.
Thank you.